Welcome to The Commute, a Bible study podcast designed to turn your commute into an opportunity to grow in your faith. Whether you're sure of what you believe or you're not sure what to believe, this podcast is designed to help you better understand who Jesus is, what the Bible's all about, and how that applies to your life today. I'm your host, Pastor Matt, and I'm excited to dive into this week's episode of The Commute. Hey, welcome to The Commute. My name is Pastor Matt.
I am Pastor Casey, riding along.
And super excited because today we're going to take some time. This year we've really been focusing on the Gospels in our reading plan. So every single week you have a chapter from the Gospel every single day in your reading. And so we're back into Luke. And it's really interesting, Luke chapter 9. And what I think is so interesting about this is the question that Jesus asks. And the answers that come out. I think it's really interesting when you look at that question in our 21st century understanding of who Jesus is. And so where we're going to be looking today is we're going to zero in on Luke chapter 9, which is going to be the last reading you're going to run into. But really, we're not just talking about Luke chapter 9. We're talking about Jesus in general and what it looks like to take Jesus for who Jesus says he is. So I'm going to go ahead and, Pastor Casey, do you want to read for us Luke chapter 9, verse 18 through 20?
Sure thing. You can follow along. Now it happened that as he was praying alone, the disciples were with him, and he asked them, "Who do the crowds say that I am?" And they answered, "John the Baptist, but others say Elijah, and others that one of the prophets of old has risen." Then he said to them, "But who do you say that I am?" And Peter answered, "The Christ of God."
Yeah, I think it's I think that's so intriguing. One of the reasons I thought it'd be fun for us to dig into this is that feels like a question people are still asking today. Like, who do you say Jesus is? I mean, there in my lifetime I've seen countless news articles that talk about who Jesus is. In fact, I think my aunt just sent me one from the newspaper. She said, "Hey, I think you might find this interesting." They said, actually, the article's title is, a Jesus who looks like me. And so I think when it comes to Jesus, everybody has a different opinion. Now, would we say the same answers that they would have said back then? No. But I think, we'd all have different answers, right? Or a lot of people would. So who do you say Jesus is? Like, some people would say he was a great teacher. Some people would say he's the savior. Some people would say he's a fictional character like Santa Claus, Other people would say he was a good man and his followers blew him out of proportion later. And then we in the church would say Jesus is God, savior, and we would ultimately say he is the place all our hope centers, which is really interesting. I'm reading this book by Ravi Zacharias, Jesus Through the East. So Ravi Zacharias comes out of the East, and he was co-authoring, this book is really old. He was co-authoring the book with somebody else who comes from an Eastern mindset. And they were looking at, what are the things that pop to people that would have been reading and seeing Jesus from the East? And in the book, it was really interesting. He said, all major religions, you could take their kind of core person and you could pull them out and you'd still have that religion. So for example, Islam, you could pull the Prophet Muhammad out and it would still be worthwhile because it's talking about Allah, because that's the central figure. You could take the Buddha out of Buddhism and you could still have all the core central teachings and stuff like that, and the religion would work. You could take some of the main characters of Hinduism out and you'd still have Hinduism as a religion and teaching philosophy. But you take Jesus out of Christianity and you no longer have Christianity. Like, he's the one figure that you cannot remove from the religion as a whole. So Jesus, you have to take Jesus, otherwise you don't have Christianity. He is that central to what we believe.
Yeah, absolutely. You take Jesus out of the equation and everything falls apart. So asking the question, who is Jesus, is a foundational one. And then the question becomes, well, where do you go to find out about Jesus? What are the authoritative voices or revelations about who Jesus is? And for us, we would say, well, our authorities are the Christian scriptures, most specifically the gospel accounts, where we have not only the narratives about Jesus, but we have the words of Jesus, his teachings, his sayings. And we take these words as we have them in the scriptures as the authority, saying that these paint a true and accurate picture of Jesus. And if you want to know who Jesus is, this is where you go to.
Yeah, and in fact, the gospel writers almost beg you to question the validity of the gospels. They see these as good news, but historical accounts. So you notice that through different things, like if you look at each of the major gospels, they talk about key people that you could have gone back to then and figured out if that person existed. In fact, you can find archaeological evidence that proves those people existed. Like there's extra biblical evidence that the man Jesus actually existed. People that didn't believe in Jesus, weren't Christian, that were attesting to this historical figure, Jesus, who actually existed. You look at the Gospels and you see some of the scandalous kind of pictures you get of some of the disciples. Like these are details they wouldn't share unless the account was true. Because they don't paint them in the best light. And so, when you look at those gospels, that's really what they're trying to say is, hey, this is a true account of who Jesus was. We're trying to present Jesus to you. Like John said at the end, these were written down so that you would believe in Jesus and have life in his name. And so it's really interesting. And this is kind of a fun thought I want us to dig into as we're looking at this. They ask, who do the crowds say that I am? And then Jesus digs into his disciples. And he looks at his disciples, he says, but who do you say that I am? Because that's really, if you're a follower of Jesus, your answer to that question is fundamentally more important than what the rest of the world has to say about Jesus. And this is what I love. Peter, this is that bold statement that Jesus, commends the statement. He says, Peter says, and Peter answered, the Christ of God. And so he literally nails it on the head. He pegs exactly who Jesus is and exactly what that means. And Jesus catches this. And he says, and he strictly charged and commanded them to tell this to no one. Why? Because they had off views of what that meant. And so what Jesus does next is he says, you nailed exactly who I am. Now let me tell you what that means. And Jesus goes on, he says, the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders and the chief priests and the scribes and be killed, and on the third day be raised. And he said all this, and he keeps teaching that. And in other gospel accounts, you see Peter kind of like rail against it. Like not in Luke, but in other gospel accounts, you do see Peter kind of like rail against that idea.
Yep, like in Matthew chapter 16, Peter openly rebukes Jesus in front of everybody else. And well, Jesus has some pretty strong words for Peter, even as something along the lines of "Get behind me, Satan." So clearly, how this happened was Peter maybe has his handle on the right words for the answer, but does not understand the concept of Christ, the Son of God, appropriately yet. Yeah, maybe he can say, "Oh yeah, Jesus is Christ," meaning Jesus is Messiah, promised in the Old Testament to come and to save Israel. But what that actually is going to look like isn't clear to Peter, and maybe isn't clear to you either if you haven't read the entirety of the story. But it will become clear that what Christ, Son of God, means is pretty different from what the disciples are imagining at the time they're having this dialogue with Jesus.
Yeah, and that's what's so interesting. That's why the second Peter makes that statement, Jesus starts saying, okay, now you know who I am. Let me tell you what that means. And I love that because that's still important for us today. It's one thing to know who Jesus is. But then in turn, what does that mean? And are we willing to take Jesus for who Jesus is and says he is? Or are we willing to kind of take that statement of almost like Peter and Matthew of, yeah, you're the Christ, the Son of God. Oh, no, Jesus, though. That's not how you be Christ, the Son of God. There's a different way to do that. And that's why I think it's so interesting that in Luke, not only does Jesus unpack for you what it means that he's the Messiah and that anybody who would come after him has to follow him with his cross, which is a scandalous kind of statement. But then all of a sudden, the transfiguration scene comes where Jesus takes Peter, John, and James up to the top of the mountain. All of a sudden, you see Moses and Elijah there. So you see this picture of, Moses who brought the law, who brought that first covenant. You see Elijah, who was one of the great prophets of the Old Testament. And then all of a sudden, they're standing there amidst this. And as the disciples are blown away, it says the voice out of the cloud, who's God the Father, says, "This is my son, my chosen one, listen to him." And I think it's so huge that Luke puts that in next, because I think the reality is we not only have to know who Jesus is, we have to be willing to take Jesus for who he is. And I think that's a bigger struggle than we oftentimes like to admit as Christians.
Yep. I agree with that wholeheartedly. I just want to backpedal really quickly.
Yeah.
Detail that I think is just so cool here. So notice when Jesus asked his disciples, "Who do people say that I am?" Who did they say? Well, one of them is Elijah, and another is prophet of old. Now, if you're an Israelite and you're thinking about like who's the prophet par excellence, you're thinking of Moses, the one who actually dialogued with God face to face. So you have these are like the best answers the world can come up with. Fast forward just a couple episodes to the Transfiguration. Who appears with Jesus? You've got Elijah, you've got Moses. Now, you don't have John the Baptist. It would be really cool. John the Baptist were there, but God's wisdom decides Moses and Elijah are going to be there. Yeah, it's great that they're there, but who really rises to prominence on that mountain? It's Jesus. God the Father is the one who identifies Jesus. Now, these two guys, Moses and Elijah, these are important guys, but this guy, Jesus, this is the Son. Maybe you've listened to Moses and Elijah in the past, but if you're going to listen to somebody now, listen to Jesus. I think an account of the Transfiguration is just really cool how it's set up like that. That you have Moses and Elijah in the back of your minds, and then here are Moses and Elijah, and you see Jesus rising even more high than those two.
Oh man, I love that. I've never thought about that before, but I love kind of how here are the most popular answers the world's giving. And then you're standing on the side of that mountain and one, you've got this image of, nope, Jesus is not Moses or Elijah, which is who you guys thought he was, which was, as you're saying, a really big statement to say. But not only that, God points out, who should you be listening to right now? Jesus. Wow.
So just a really quick plug, when you read the Bible, read it in context and juxtapose stories that are close to one another and next to one another, because you'll see some really cool stuff like that.
That's really cool. Yeah, you could almost think of the Bible like a puzzle, and each piece fits perfectly together. So it's not by accident, like Casey's saying, that Jesus' confession is right there with the Transfiguration. I think that's huge. Oh man, that's so cool. Well, hey, this is a really interesting thought as we're going in that track, and you've got God saying, listen to him. If you think about some of the core things that Jesus taught, I was listening to this podcast. Carrie Newhoff was interviewing Tim Keller. Tim Keller is a brilliant theologian and pastor out of New York City, started a really big church in New York City, Redeemer Presbyterian in like the early 90s. And it has since, incredible church, but he's just a brilliant theologian, very gospel-centered, scripture-centered theologian. And he said, the interesting thing when you're preaching is that oftentimes we try to politically polarize Jesus. And I love this kind of idea. He says, Jesus, when you take Jesus for what he actually says, he's offensive to the conservative and to the liberal. And he says this. He says that when Tim reads the Bible, he sees four things clearly. That Christians ought to be sold out for racial justice. Christians should be deeply concerned about the poor. Christians should be pro-life. And Christians should believe, at least for Christians, that sex should only be between a man and woman in marriage. Now, what's interesting, Tim Keller goes on, he says, two of those beliefs look very conservative and two of those look very liberal. And the church has to find a way to preach both. Most Christian churches will feel pressure to focus on two of these and neglect the others. You can't give in to letting politics direct what you teach and believe as a church. And I think that's where it gets really interesting, because I think what Tim points out is, you know, if we're going to take Jesus for who Jesus is, then we have to take Jesus for everything he says and does. Like, we can't pick and choose, but oftentimes what we have a tendency to do is pick and choose. And sometimes we pick and choose by picking the issues that most fit our issues. So, you know, if we believe in social justice, if we believe in, you know, helping the poor, then we will lean into everything Jesus has to say on that. And we'll kind of minimize the other stuff he's talking about. If we're really into, you know, pro-life movement and we're really into kind of a conservative sexual ethic, then we will lean into what Jesus says about that. And we may even kind of pull away from the other things, you know. And honestly, we don't have to define for you which would be considered conservative or liberal issues, because, you know, that's obvious when you pick up the news. But, you know, what Jesus is saying and doing is that sometimes when Jesus speaks, he will offend you, because Jesus' views aren't always your views, if that makes sense.
It makes perfect sense. And I think it's important for us to highlight the challenge that it is to take Jesus as, well, take the whole Jesus. It is so easy for us to grab the bits and pieces that are most convenient or most applicable in our daily lives. But I think this is why it is crucial for us to be doing things like reading the Gospels and reading them in their entirety, and receiving all that Jesus has to teach and say, and to witness and experience all that he has done, and be confronted with the aspects of Jesus that maybe challenge us or push us or orient us into a different way of thinking or being. And perhaps there's no better episode to zero in on than the episode we've zeroed in on in chapter 9, because this is Jesus confronting the person who maybe just wants to grab a bit or piece of Jesus that works for them. The person who maybe wants to grab the bit of Jesus who's going to be the one to redeem the nation, to bring salvation to his people, and lead them into a better promised land, is confronted with the reality that all of that stuff is only going to come by the scandalous, humiliating death of Jesus. And for anybody who's going to walk that path with Jesus, they're going to have to take up their cross. So yeah, even for somebody like me, Jesus is confrontational, and Jesus is uncomfortable at times.
Yeah, and I love that concept, because, you know, in moments it will grate against you, but to remember that God's saying, look, this is the one you're supposed to be listening to. You know, if you want Jesus to bend to your will, then essentially what you're doing is you're listening to someone else. You're either listening to yourself, is what we would say, but in reality, you're probably listening to the pull of other things outside of yourself, you know, cultural pulls, political pulls, whatever those may be, you know, instead of here's Jesus, here's what he says. Now, here's why that's important. Yeah. Is it a challenge sometimes to take Jesus for all of Jesus? Absolutely. It should challenge us, because we're sinful and broken, and he's not. You know, he's given us a picture of, he's giving us a picture of what life looks like when life is lived out in a perfect way, where I'm loving God and loving my neighbor in perfect harmony, But here's the exciting thing. If I'm willing to grab a hold of all of Jesus, I get all of Jesus. So the same Jesus that will challenge me is the same Jesus that's willing to go to the cross to die for me. The same Jesus that's asking me to sacrifice my views on how I think things should work is the same Jesus that sacrifices his life for mine. Which, if you think about it, what a way better trade-off. I re-examine the way I see the world, knowing that the heart of Jesus is not, I don't want you to believe that, deal with it. But the heart of Jesus is a heart that's willing to give everything. So then what you're able to see when you kind of look at that, if Jesus is willing to give everything, then at the heart of these views Jesus holds on to is the same heart. And so what he's essentially saying is, yeah, you think this is the best way, but here I am. I've already proven to you that I'm willing to give everything. I'm willing to sacrifice everything. If you hold on to what I believe, is it possible that what I believe is better than what you believe? Is it possible that the way I want you to go is a better direction than the way you want to go? And I think the answer becomes obvious when you look at Jesus in the context of what Jesus came to do.
Absolutely. I think the way it plays out in my life is with the metaphor of competition. I think often when I'm confronted, I want to compete against. So if Jesus think that maybe I just really am having difficulty with or not jiving with, I feel this sort of inner competition or competitive streak welling up in me, trying to almost work against what Jesus is saying, and maybe trying to find a better way. But I find that I can't win that competition. I cannot compete against Jesus and win. So when I stop competing, then Jesus becomes the one who competes for me. And when Jesus competes,
ooh, that's good.
The real victory is won. And it's this letting go. All right, I submit. I am not going to fight this. Take up your cross, Casey, and follow Jesus. It's in taking up the cross that Jesus now isn't somebody I'm competing against, but somebody who's competing for me. And well, when he wins the victory and is bringing you along with him, you win too.
Oh man, I love that picture. When I'm not competing against Jesus, Jesus is competing for me. Huge. Oh man, I don't think there's anything better to end on than that. That's incredible. So yeah, is it going to be a challenge to take Jesus views? Will Jesus views be offensive at times? Absolutely. But just realize the one that's offending is the one that has already proven he loves you more than anything else. The one who's offending is already proven he's the one that will sacrifice the most for you. So take the whole Jesus, because the whole Jesus is worth holding on to. And realize it's okay if it challenges you. It challenges us all. I love that. So, hey guys, it's been so much fun hanging out with you right here on The Commute. Thanks for checking this out. If you want more resources to help you grow in your faith, especially in this time of quarantine, download the Bethlehem Church Live mobile app. And then 2, you can share these things out. So if you find something that is a blessing to you, feel free to share it with somebody else, whether you share an episode or whether you share the Commute podcast. It's an opportunity to be able to grow closer to Jesus, because the more we grow closer to Jesus, the more we look like Jesus. So till next week, it's been a joy hanging out with you right here on The Commute. Thanks for checking out this episode of The Commute. For more information on The Commute or to join the Commute Bible reading plan, simply download the Bethlehem Church Live mobile app or go to BethlehemChurchLive/The Commute.